Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Luke Ulas from the University of Sheffield and Josh Hobbs from the University of Leeds are both interested in cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is a name used for a few different political ideas, but perhaps the core thought, and I'm quoting from the Stanford Encyclopaedia of Philosophy here, is the idea that all human beings, regardless of their political affiliation, are, or can and should be, citizens in a single community. It's a strongly internationalist idea, and as such, one might think it's an idea that's in retreat, at least in some countries today. That's one of the issues we'll be discussing, as well as whether there's a crisis of motivation of cosmopolitanism, what that means, and what one might do about it. So, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So, we're going to talk about motivating cosmopolitanism, but I thought it would be helpful, first of all, if you could just give me an idea of what cosmopolitanism means.
Sure. So, I guess the sort of starting point of what cosmopolitanism is, it's maybe helpful to think about the ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes, who supposedly lived in a barrel in the marketplace in Greece. And when he was asked where he came from, he said that he considered himself a citizen of the world rather than a citizen of the state in which he lived.
Right.
So that seems to be the starting point. When people identify as a cosmopolitan, they identify as a citizen of the world in some sense. But what we specifically mean by that is going to differ.
Yeah, and I think in more contemporary meanings and in the sort of academic political theory literature that we're both steeped in, I guess the central thread that runs through what it means when we talk about cosmopolitanism is something like some kind of broad moral commitment to the equality of all people throughout the world. So the moral equality of all people throughout the world. So we understand that there's nothing particularly superior or important about the people amongst whom I happen to live or happen to be politically connected to in terms of a state or a nation. And that may, and does for some of the more kind of radical cosmopolitans, I suppose, lead to particular political prescriptions that are going to change how we think about things or how we structure our world quite significantly. So some, and perhaps most of the cosmopolitans who's familiar with this literature would be thinking about at the moment would come to mind would be the sort of people who make very strong claims about how we should change our thinking about distributive justice. So maybe we need some kind of more egalitarian distribution of resources throughout the world in order to pay due heed to the fact that we do consider everyone throughout the world our moral equals.
Right.
But that's not at all necessarily a part of what it means to be a cosmopolitan. One could have a quite limited understanding of the actual political consequences of thinking everyone as a moral equal. Perhaps It wouldn't go much further than thinking that global poverty is bad and we ought to lift everyone up to a level at which they can have the minimum amount of resources they need to live a good life, for example, and no need for there to be any kind of equality, economically speaking.
Right.
So quite what the implications are of this underlying moral commitment to the moral equality of all people, quite what those commitments are, diverges between different sort of cosmopolitan thinkers. And in fact, a lot of people who reject the whole word cosmopolitan are nevertheless committed to this underlying moral equality of all people. You can be committed to that moral equality and still think there's particular political significance in your state and in your nation that leads to some kind of practical inequality in the way that people relate to each other.
Right. So I was going to say, like, a really radical interpretation of it might say that, a government has no more responsibility towards the citizens of its own state than it does towards anybody else in the world, right? But we're not necessarily talking about anything as strong or as radical.
No, not necessarily, no. Although some people do want to make those kind of claims. And of course that has therefore big implications for why we would want to have separate states at all. And certain cosmopolitans don't see any significance in in those separate states existing.
Okay.
Yes, I think it can be helpful to distinguish between different forms of cosmopolitanism. So we might talk about ethical or moral cosmopolitanism, which is the kind of thing that Luke was mentioning there when we basically say, you know, we're fundamentally committed to the moral equality of all people. And that's sort of our starting point, regardless of where they live. Then also I think you can sort of talk about institutional or political cosmopolitanism, when you might look at different ways of sort of organizing the world as a consequence of that. So sometimes it's helpful to kind of contrast cosmopolitanism, say, with nationalism. So the idea that the national political community has some great significance. For cosmopolitans, as Luke says, perhaps they might still see the nation as important, but they're certainly not going to see it as kind of their primary allegiance. Their allegiance is, you know, to the moral equality of all human beings, to being a citizen of the world in some sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose my instinct is that probably most people, I don't know exactly what proportion of people, but certainly a lot of people would be cosmopolitans in that basic sense of believing in the moral equality of all people, right? At least in some sense. I think it would probably be fairly unusual for somebody to think, you know, certain kinds of people have more moral worth than others. But you might think, nonetheless, my moral responsibilities towards people who are closer to me are much stronger, or something like that. Yeah.
So one of the criticisms that cosmopolitanism as a theoretical idea has received recently is that, well, this is just quite commonplace or banal or kind of redundant thing to say. Like, we all agree these days, don't we, that you know, everyone around the world has is a moral equal, that no one's kind of, other than, you know, outright racists or similar. Very few people tend to believe that some people are just inherently worth more than others. So why is this an interesting theory? And people can incorporate that central idea of the sort of fundamental moral equality of all and still make arguments that resist the idea that we have any positive obligations to other people in parts of the world, or we have very limited obligations. Maybe we have obligations to respect their human rights, because that seems like something, if moral equality is to mean anything, it seems like it might mean that we help people who are in significant distress or something like that. But it doesn't mean that we need to sort of reorganize our entire global political architecture or redistribute resources so that they're equally distributed throughout the entire world. That certainly is a kind of criticism that's made. And I think one way of responding to that criticism is just to, in a sense, accept it and say, well, you are avoiding or rejecting the word cosmopolitanism or the usefulness of the theory of cosmopolitanism, but you're still evidencing yourself some kind of cosmopolitan commitment. That's at least how I would want to say it. The fact that it's now a very wide-ranging, potentially a very wide-ranging and widely endorsed commitment, I think can be accepted. And then that leads to what I think we're interested in, which is even though those very basic commitments seem to be very widespread, there seems to be a lack of acting upon those widespread commitments. Another way of responding to the critique is just to say, well, actually, we should understand it, if we're thinking about it properly, to necessarily lead to some quite big changes in the way we organise our lives and the way we interact with people in other parts of the world. So if we're really thinking seriously about what it means to understand other people as moral equals, we would need to create new global institutions that give practical effect to that, or we would need to redistribute resources such that people were standing in circumstances that look more equal. Either of those two ways are evident and possible in the literature. I think I personally I'm willing to just grant that it's quite a capacious idea, cosmopolitanism, and it encompasses quite a lot of people's fundamental understandings of how the world is. But for that reason, we're interested in thinking about why that still doesn't lead to people to actually change their behaviours to sort of try to meet those potentially very modest moral commitments.
Good, yeah, okay. And I wanted to ask, I mean, feel free to not answer this, but I just wondered whether, and you might have different answers, I suppose, the two of you, to this question, but do you consider yourselves to be cosmopolitans? And if so, in what sense?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, frustratingly, I'm going to say yes and no. So, yes, I would consider myself to be a cosmopolitan in the sense that I'm fundamentally committed to the moral equality of all humans. I think that national identity is not something that I personally consider to be incredibly important, but I would probably define myself as kind of a moderate moral or ethical cosmopolitan. So what I'd like to see is, less global injustice and the kind of motivational questions that I'm interested in, and not necessarily bringing everybody in the world to like absolute equality, but sort of moving us in the direction of justice, moving us in the direction of realizing human rights or basic human rights for most people in the world.
Yeah. And Luke, would you feel the same or slightly different?
Yeah, I mean, I think given that I just wanted to say that pretty much anyone other than outright racists can be incorporated as evidencing that moral commitment, then I would want to describe myself as a cosmopolitan on that basis. I also tend to be positively disposed towards cosmopolitanism as a particular side of a debate in political philosophy as well. So I was taken. There's a long-standing debate, or there was, between cosmopolitans on the one hand and statists or nationalists on the other hand. So statists and nationalists want to make arguments defending some aspect of the nation-state order and its moral significance, and cosmopolitans tending to argue in the other way, saying there's some, the sorts of arguments that supposedly make it the case that, justice applies only within the state actually have implications that we should, global implications that we should recognise that they can be transferred to the global level. I was always more sympathetic to those arguments when reading them. So I guess both in the kind of commonsensical understanding of cosmopolitanism that I put forward and in the kind of in the sense of the academic literature, I would tend to associate myself with it, one way or another.
Okay. Good. Okay. Another thing I was wondering about is, so one thing that people quite often say recently, and with quite a lot of evidence, is that there's been a rise globally in kind of populist nationalism, right? So that's something that we've seen in this country, but you also see it in France with Marine Le Pen, and you see it in America with Trump and so on, and various other places around the world. Do you think that means that there's a kind of general trend away from cosmopolitanism, that cosmopolitanism's in retreat in a way at the moment, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think broadly I would agree. I think that retreat needs to be put in context, though. So I think that there's definitely a sense in which people have come to associate cosmopolitan ideals with kind of a liberal elite, perhaps like a global elite, where they sort of see cosmopolitanism as something that is, like not necessarily a good thing for sort of ordinary working people or something like that. And some of the backlash against cosmopolitanism is perhaps deserved.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to place that in the context of perhaps society moving in, or the world in general, moving in quite a cosmopolitan direction broadly, with sort of a minor retreat going on within that broader context, is how I would see it. I mean, people who are sort of involved in these kind of backlashes against cosmopolitanism, they're responding to the idea of cosmopolitanism and the idea that they have to justify why they don't see themselves in that way, which in some ways kind of shows the dominance of the idea.
Yeah, okay.
I think if I wanted to deny that this was evidence of cosmopolitanism in retreat, I'd probably try and make a distinction between globalization and cosmopolitanism.
Right.
And a lot of what we've seen in the last 10 years, or the rise of nationalist populism and these kinds of sentiments, I think maybe could be styled as a reaction to increasing globalization, but not that globalization wasn't necessarily instituting kind of cosmopolitan moral ideals, or at least that could be claimed. And so, I'm not sure that the necessarily that we see this as a sort of direct hit to those ideals themselves, but rather I think a lot of people, certainly there's some people involved in those movements who are kind of opposed to conceiving of the world as one moral order, and they're very much emphasizing the particular sanctity and importance of their nation and so on. But there are also some people, I think, who've seen what's happened over the last however many decades as exploitative and unjust, rather than the implementation of any kind of global justice. I mean, that's somewhat up for debate in terms of the effect that globalization has had on levels of inequality and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I think the distinction, a lot of cosmopolitans are anti the globalization that we've had. There's lots of cosmopolitans who you might be able to associate with what's often known as the alter globalization movement, so trying to protest against the globalization that we've in fact had, and maybe trying to give us a different kind of globalization in the future.
It's interesting. Josh, did you want to?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying as well that at the same time as these things going on, we're also seeing more and more of the problems that we talk about at a national level being sort of problems that can only be solved internationally or globally. So take kind of the salience of like climate change, for example. I think most people realize that we're kind of all in it together on these issues to some extent, in that like there needs to be a global solution. Otherwise, there's not going to be a solution.
Yeah.
So at the same time as people might be thinking nationalistically about some things, perhaps it's also a big part of the current conversation is that we are sort of one community, one world, and that a lot of the problems that we face can only be tackled together.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the answer is that, as to so many things at the moment, that it's a question about polarization, right? So as some people move away from some of these ideas, others become maybe even more attracted to it. So it's not a simple picture of advance or retreat. So I was just thinking about, if you think about Trumpian politics, right, firstly, it does have a kind of move away from globalization in an economic sense, right? So it's associated with protectionist policies, for example. But it's also denialism about climate change, right, which can be seen as a response to exactly what you're saying there, the idea that we're all in it together. Well, no, we're not. It's America first, right? But it's also, a move against foreign intervention, like in Ukraine, for example. So there's a few things, but it does seem like it's the common factor there is a kind of retrenchment and a move towards an emphasis on the nation state rather than the global politics.
I think the picture is quite bamboozling, really, because like you say, you do have these processes of retrenchment and retreat that would seem to be a mark against the viability of some kind of cosmopolitan order. But at the same time, very recently in sort of the literature that we read, certain cosmopolitans have attempted to go out there into the world and conduct empirical surveys about, well, what is it that people actually think? How many people are prepared to associate in general terms with the idea of the citizen of the world? Very undefined idea, but just as a kind of identity tag. But also, people have conducted surveys where they'd ask, well, how responsive would you be to the idea of like a new world parliament in which people were directly represented alongside state representatives? Or even speaking in terms of more sort of centralized and coercive global law, which sounds like kind of the bogeyman to a lot of the people that we've just been talking about. And there seems to be, according to this empirical literature anyway, quite strong endorsements of these ideas, endorsements of the ideas of global democracy and global parliamentary processes and these kinds of things, which is very, very surprising. I have to say, when I read this literature, I find it quite surprising. That's one thing, especially when we line that up with how things seem to be going in the world. But also surprising and important for the current processes, the current work that we want to do, that we'll talk about in a bit, which is that well, if that's the case, why does it seem to be that in fact nothing is happening in that direction? Why does why is there apparent principal commitment to these ideas, but no real motivation or possibility of getting them off the ground and getting them off the page and into real world practice? And one thing, and we're sort of proposing in the first place to look at that through the lens of motivation, although we're not convinced necessarily that's the right lens, but that's something we can maybe talk about a bit more.
Yeah, well, let's get on to that then. Yeah, so your project is about cosmopolitan motivation. So, could you just say a bit about why someone might think that there is a problem of cosmopolitan motivation?
Yeah, sure. So one way I would think about this is as you say, people look like they're fairly committed to these cosmopolitan principles, at least in theory, but it seems fairly obvious that even people who spend most of their working life going on about cosmopolitanism, it looks like they perhaps are not so committed to them in practice, right? You know, and I mean, if you sort of lay out the bare rational facts that something like, I don't know, I think it's like 23,000 children are supposed to die every day from global poverty-related causes. Like, I know that. You probably know that already. But if not, I don't really expect you to kind of jump up and change your life after me having told you that. So it kind of does look like, if we want to say that people do care about other people and that they are committed to these kind of cosmopolitan beliefs of sorts, that there's kind of a real mismatch between the beliefs and the action.
Okay. Hello. This is just a brief interruption to tell you about an event that IDEA the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds is hosting as part of its 20th anniversary celebrations this year. We're delighted to be welcoming Gavin Esler, journalist, presenter and author, to present a public lecture, Dead Cats, Strategic Lying and Truth Decay, on the evening of Tuesday, the 17th of June, at Clothall Court in Leeds. Gavin is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and author. He's best known for presenting the BBC's flagship Newsnight programme. He also spent a number of years as the BBC's chief North American correspondent, as well as reporting in other countries. He's the author of 5 novels and 4 non-fiction books commenting on politics in the modern world. Drawing on his recent book, Britain is Better Than This, Gavin will analyse the state of current politics and truth-telling in the public realm. He will argue that people no longer trust businesses or politicians or journalists as much as they used to, and that this is the result of what he calls the politics of distraction. He will discuss how a loss of trust and truth decay is eating away some of the core principles of democracy in the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere, and will suggest how trust and truth can be reinforced. You can book your place at the event by going to our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics and clicking on the link to find out about our 20th anniversary events. We'll also put a link in the show notes for this podcast. Thanks. Now back to the interview. So the idea is that there is a mismatch between the beliefs and the action. So people tend to have broadly cosmopolitan beliefs, but they aren't necessarily motivated to act on those beliefs. Yeah, so I was wondering, I mean, you've said a bit about this already, I suppose, but why should we think that the problem is motivation as opposed to belief? So why not conclude that, well, people don't really believe in cosmopolitanism then, right? Why is it a question of motivation?
Yeah, I suppose this is something that we want to ask for ourselves, I suppose. And there's 2 different ways of cashing that question out as well. There's a more deeply philosophical way in that one might think that if one reliably and consistently doesn't act upon the things that they supposedly believe, then maybe they don't in fact believe them in the way that one that one might think that if you really do believe X, then it would be it would follow on from that you would go act so as to achieve X, or
Right.
it could just be that people are saying things without really believing them in a deep way. So then the issue wouldn't then in fact be one of motivation. It would be one of authenticity of belief or something like that.
Yeah.
That it would be one of like really checking whether people do in fact believe what they're saying they believe. But another way is to take the view that people do really believe these things, take their belief statements as read, and then ask why they're not being acted upon. And one reason might be that for whatever reason, they just don't feel sufficiently motivated to go out and do that. So I think at least, and I think for the project, the most useful way of setting it out or the most challenging way of setting it out is in the way that Josh has already done, to sort of focus on the most basic kind of seemingly obvious global harms that are occurring to people in the world that don't require a very extreme version of cosmopolitan moral commitment. They don't require us to think in terms of global equality. They just require us to think in terms of a commitment to avoiding the worst suffering and death and poverty amongst certain quite large swathes of the world. Even there, and I think most people would say that's wrong, that's bad, I have a moral commitment against that happening. Even there doesn't seem to be stopping. So is that a problem of motivation? And the reason why we're starting there is that to the extent that this question has been investigated already by political philosophers, that has been the way in which it's been investigated. It's been talked about as a question of motivation, hasn't it? And there has been some theoretical and some empirical attempts to investigate this issue. So we want to start there, but at least speaking for myself, I'm not convinced necessarily that motivation will end up being the right lens through which to think about this problem, and that maybe there'll be other reasons why actions do or don't occur. People often act in certain ways or don't act in certain ways without being motivated or demotivated to do them, but just because people act according to habit, or they don't act according to certain kind of an inertia, or they just have other things that crowd out their moral commitments.
Right. Or there might be kind of structural reasons that are kind of standing in the way of their ability to act on their beliefs.
Or structural reasons that make us look like we're more morally committed to certain people than we in fact are. So the most obvious thing there would be coercive redistributed systems in ones like the country that we live in here. Like, we have redistributed to a degree benefit systems and so on. And so it kind of looks like I'm more motivated if you just look at the fact that some of my money goes to people in this country and it doesn't go to people in France or Denmark or Zimbabwe or whatever. Maybe that would look on paper like I'm more committed to my fellow nationals. But in fact, it's not anything that I'm doing different either way. Someone takes my money and gives it for taxes, gives it to certain people and not others. So in fact, it might well be these kind of structural things that are at the root of what looks like a motivational problem.
Yeah.
So I think another thing that's quite interesting with the example you give there, Luke, of sort of our money going to, say, like benefits at the national level, but maybe not so much at the international level, is sort of disentangling the role of our partial commitments there, in that, in a sense, most people sort of do share the same nation, or many people share the same nation state with their family and the like. And it looks like when you support those programs, you're also sort of looking after your partial commitments in some sense. The people could be benefited by the NHS in a way that they perhaps wouldn't be if you sent, money to address sort of examples of extreme global poverty elsewhere. Although I probably should nail my colours to the mast a little bit, as perhaps I don't think that this is entirely an issue of motivation, but I'm probably maybe a little more committed to the idea that motivation is a very important part of this than Luke, I think, maybe. So I take a sentimentalist view of this, where I kind of think that the problem is that although we might hold rational commitments that say that somebody's life in another country is worth the same as anyone else, that ultimately we sort of lack the sentimental connection to those individuals that's necessary to motivate the action, So perhaps you see somebody suffering in front of you and you feel kind of moved to address it. But when they're kind of very far away, we don't really have sort of the immediate emotional reaction that you otherwise would have. So, I wouldn't want to speak for Luke because I think I personally am reasonably committed to that sort of view, but I don't think that's the whole issue. I think that's a big part of it.
That's good. So we should probably just explain, when you say sentimental attachment, you just mean emotional attachment, right?
Yeah. Just the basic idea that the reason that we tend to act morally is because we care, we emotionally care.
Perhaps we're empathetic as well.
Yeah, we empathize for the person, we have sympathy, whatever. There's huge philosophical debates about these kind of things, but I think the broad idea is a pretty plausible one, right?
Yeah. Part of the idea, if I'm not mistaken, is that what actually motivates us to act is not cool-headed logical argument, that the type of things that analytic philosophers usually produce. I mean, we might well be sort of rationally convinced of those arguments, like you say, but then when it comes to actually acting upon them, what motivates and stimulates action, maybe it's more things that are less rational, more emotional, like you say, or that can stir us in different ways that the logical, nicely set out argument in a journal article or something may not be able to do.
Yeah, you could kind of think of it as, for philosophical arguments to kind of gain purchase, to kind of work, somebody has to already fit within our kind of sentimental attachments in such a way that those arguments apply to them. Okay. So we hear an argument about equal moral worth or sort of helping others who are suffering, but they've kind of got to fall within our sphere of concern for that argument to work on us, is the way I would see it. And that's ultimately a sentimental or an emotional thing.
Great. That's really interesting. So we should say that you're at the beginning of a project, right, where you're going to bring some people together to think about some of these issues and try and come up with some answers. So could you say a bit about what that project is and how you're going to approach it?
Yeah, so we previously set up and attempted to find who's out there who's working on these kind of questions relating to motivation and cosmopolitanism, and to bring them together in what we called the very uniquely the Motivating Cosmopolitanism Project or Network. And so but so far that's just been kind of an online network with a more or less dormant website. But we've recently managed to get some funding to be able to actually bring many of those people in the network, and also hopefully some more people who are out there who we don't know about yet from a range of different disciplines together to actually actively sort of collaboratively work in an interdisciplinary manner on these questions. So sometime next year we'll host a gathering of people here in the University of Sheffield where we'll hopefully make some headway on these kinds of questions and eventually see some outputs coming out of that as well further down the line.
Okay. And who are you going to bring together? So people working in different disciplines, but which disciplines specifically?
Well, some of the disciplines that we have collaborated with in the past on this research network and sort of looking to collaborate with in more detail and further, I suppose, would be sort of social psychologists, people working in international development, different forms of psychologists, sort of people in international relations, standard philosophers, ethicists. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's any other disciplines that spring to mind.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people working in sort of behavioural economics and these kinds of ideas and these kind of areas as well. I think potentially have a lot of, I think political psychology more generally. I think there's probably lots for us to be able to productively interact with people working in these areas with. General call out if you're out there interested working on these things. We'll be advertising soon. Call the papers and advertising this workshop that we're hoping to put together.
Great, and could we maybe give the web address at the end of the podcast? I'll leave it for now, but if you can, I'll
Sure.
ask you at the end of the podcast for the web address so people can come and find you. But I was just wondering, so can you say anything about what you think those people from different disciplines are going to bring to the table? So there's psychologists, economists, political theorists, I suppose, ethicists as well. So what are all these different people going to be contributing?
So the way I would see it is that the kind of questions that we're interested in answering are not purely normative questions, and they're not purely empirical questions, in the sense that they're not just about oughts or, how things should be, and they're not just about sort of the facts of the matter. So that makes them really fascinating questions, but it makes them sort of necessarily interdisciplinary questions. So bringing together people who work on the empirical side and people who work on the normative side looks like we're going to be able to kind of answer them much better, because it seems like some people try and address these questions through just through philosophical argument. But it looks like that then you just tend to end up speculating or drawing on sort of research in a way where maybe you're not doing it in the most informed manner in terms of drawing on empirical research. And then there's other people out there doing empirical research, but maybe they're not really getting to grips with the sort of the difficult normative questions and issues there, and some of the philosophical sort of questions around, what is a belief and motivation, and sort of, maybe these people don't really hold the beliefs if they don't act on them, and these kind of questions. So for me, it's just about bringing together the empirical and the normative to try and make some headway.
Yeah.
And I think there's a hope that we can do this in a genuinely collaborative way as well. Like you said, rather than sort of picking and choosing from empirical work that's out there, for example, actually work in the first place with people in different disciplines to produce a research question and work out how to properly investigate it, both with this expertise of more philosophically minded people and also more empirically minded people at the same time. So that's the aspiration.
Yeah. And what do you hope will be the outputs of the research?
Ultimately, hopefully a series of different articles, essentially, that we'll bring together in an edited collection. That's the primary goal, and we'll hope that will stimulate a broader research agenda, maybe be a jumping off point for more extended work in this kind of area. But yes, I think that's the main plan at the moment.
Yeah, good. But also it strikes me that this kind of stuff is really important and interesting, and probably would be important and interesting to people not just working in academia, right? So are you aiming to make some of the insights that you're going to develop from this research available to, for example, policymakers or just to the general public to inform people about this stuff?
So we are certainly looking at making some of the outputs of this sort of much more accessible. Yeah. So we're sort of going to write some articles for The Conversation, some other kind of popular places where we'll sort of summarize some of our findings. Maybe we'll come back on this podcast or something like that. And I
was going to ask if you would. It would be great if we could get you back.
What we found and how it's gone, and hopefully there'll be other ways we can publicize the findings. Yeah. And I think another thing that's sort of worth emphasizing is that we're hoping to write sort of articles or chapters where sort of empirical researchers and philosophical researchers hopefully collaborate to some degree on the papers or the chapters. So, we're kind of genuinely trying to do the interdisciplinary research that so much philosophy talks about being important, but then never really actually does.
Great, yeah. But do you think that this is, whatever the kind of answers turn out to be, do you think this is the kind of thing that politicians, for example, should be acting on, right? That they should be taking this stuff into account when they're developing policy?
That's a tricky question. Being totally honest, that I wouldn't feel like we were producing work that we were trying to pitch directly at.
Yeah.
That's an interest. It's a difficult one, and it's not unrelated to the topic itself, because the politician a prime minister or some other senior politician within a particular state will understand themselves, given the current attitudes of their citizens, to have particular primary responsibility for the well-being of those citizens. And so, to the extent how politically viable it is to tell them, oh, we've got some new information about how you can be a better cosmopolitan leader and how you can lead your people towards more cosmopolitan behaviour, would likely not go down that well, I imagine. So I wouldn't want to make overly bold claims for what this could do in sort of real world political sphere. But that is the case, I think, is also quite an interesting one. Given that, as I've said, there does seem to be some evidence out there that on the one hand, people are quite well disposed to sort of quite basic cosmopolitan commitments, but on the other hand, when it came to encouraging those same people to act, to alter our governmental processes to sort of realise those aims, at the same time, it would probably be the case that would be quite deeply unpopular, I imagine.
Right.
Politically speaking. So, it's a difficult conundrum.
Did you want to say something, Josh?
Yeah, so I think that there's certainly sort of practitioners out there who might be interested in the results of our research, whether they're based in government or not. So, I mean, sort of third sector organisations. So Oxfam has like the global citizenship program, I believe, where they genuinely are interested in sort of the broader implications of what it means to be cosmopolitan and how you make somebody a sort of better citizen of the world.
Yes.
So there's definitely going to potentially be real world outputs here and sort of things that have some relevance for what's going on outside of the academy, even if we're sort of primarily interested in these questions because we find them fascinating.
That's the more positive, optimistic answer.
I was just thinking in response to what you were saying, Luke, is there an interesting ethical question there about, like, as a politician in a democracy, like, in what way are you supposed to be responsive to the beliefs and or the motivations of the people, right? So if it turns out that most people have cosmopolitan beliefs, but they don't have cosmopolitan motivations, and you're a politician who, like, would it be legitimate for you to try to sort of nudge people towards actually being more motivated in line with their beliefs, or is that kind of unacceptably paternalistic? I don't know whether there's an answer.
I think you'd have to be first of all completely assured that these were people's genuine beliefs that they really wanted to act upon, but they just for some reason were backsliding and weren't sufficiently able to do what they really believe they ought to do. If somehow we knew that with certainty, then maybe that would seem or the nudging politician in that case would just be helping people to help themselves. And there wouldn't obviously be something problematic about that. But as we raised earlier, maybe there's one worry about, do people really believe the things that they seem to say they believe? And in those sorts of circumstances, maybe it does look much more problematic to suppose that we know what people believe and then act on that in a way that actually their actions, the citizens' actions, look like that are not corresponding with those supposed beliefs. And then, the politician also, of course, has to work out whether what they do is going to lead to their being kicked out of office in a few years' time.
Yes.
That of course, from their perspective, is also a very pressing and legitimate thing to be concerned about.
Yeah, Josh.
So I think it's worth saying as well that the current setup is not exactly neutral, right? I mean, people's national identities were arguably, or not even arguably, pretty clearly molded, shaped, created, strengthened through the behaviour of politicians, through sort of the development of national presses and the like in the past. So it looks like in the same way that politicians have to sort of wrestle with the idea of whether they might want to act to sort of make people sort of develop a more cosmopolitan identity, it looks like there's not really neutral grounds here, because otherwise they're arguably sort of contributing to the continuation of entrenching national identities that themselves were sort of created and fostered to some extent, at least.
Great. This is all really interesting stuff. So, yeah, I was going to say it would be fantastic if you could both come back on the podcast when you're sort of towards the end of the project, maybe, and you've got some answers to some of these questions, or at least some potential answers, and tell us what those are. That would be great. But in the meantime, we did also say we were going to give out the web address so people can go and find out more about the network and maybe contribute.
Sure. So we now are at motivatingcosmopolitanism.com.
Well, that's easy enough, isn't it? Great. All right. Well, that'll do then. So Josh Hobbs and Luke Ulas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.